I was born in Birmingham, and I was 9 years and 2 months old when the war began and my childhood suddenly ended, as abruptly as that. We always went on holiday for the last 2 weeks of August, and our favourite place was Tenby in South Wales. Occasionally my father insisted we went somewhere different, but Tenby was always ours. And on September the 1st, which was a Friday, 1939, I can remember standing outside the next door house to where we had rooms, because they didn't have a radio, because people didn't have radios in those days, and we stood outside their window round about dinner time in the middle of the day, listening to the news bulletin, because my father was trying to make up his mind whether we'd better go home immediately instead of waiting till the next day as planned. Well, my father decided we would wait till the day that was planned, the Saturday, and we travelled by train in those days. So we went home, and the train stopped and stopped and stopped so many times it took us all day to get back to Birmingham. When we did get back on September the 2nd, on the Saturday evening, my mother found that my brothers their school had already been evacuated to Gloucester. Fortunately, the lad over the road, his parents had been away, so he was late getting back, and they had a car, so they took their son and my brothers to Gloucester on the Sunday morning early. And my school, I was at the junior school, had been closed completely, not evacuated. Of course, we didn't know what was in store. We didn't know whether we were going to get bombed immediately. We just didn't know what to expect at all. Fortunately, my godmother, who lived opposite, had a car, and she took me straight away on that Sunday morning to Broadway in Worcestershire, where my other grandparents lived. And so I went there for 2 months. My brothers went to Gloucester. My mother and father and grandfather set about blackout. That was the first consideration. All the windows had to be blacked out in some way or other. And we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 big bay windows. It was a villa-type house with attics. They all had curtains, but of course you'd either got to get blackout curtain lining to black them out, or you'd not got to switch a light on at all, or you'd got to make a framework of some sort to fit into them, whatever you could. And of course we got all the other windows as well. Well, of course everybody had been getting the blackout material while we'd been away on holiday, so there'd been a tremendous run on it, and you can imagine the shops were pretty empty of anything like that. Shops weren't open on Sundays, so it really meant that my parents set to work on the Monday. My father was at work, and Grandpa and my mother set about blacking out the house. Fortunately, we didn't have an air raid that night, although I was already away, but war had been declared by Winston Churchill. So there was our grannies in the country, and I went to the village school in Broadway. There was one other child from Middlesex who had been evacuated, and we seemed to be far ahead of everybody else at that stage. And I walked, of course you could walk to school in those quite safely along village roads. You had to keep crossing the road because the pavement ended here and went on the other side of the road, so I don't know how many times we crossed the road to get to the village school. It was about a mile. But everything was so safe in the country. In fact, the story goes that my mother visited my grandma at some stage during the war and found that she had no blackout to her pantry window. Oh, she said, it's all right, they won't come round the back, which rather tickled us. My brothers were in Gloucester, and they were billeted with very nice brother and sister with a housekeeper in a wonderful house, and they had these three clumping lads who played rugby in their beautiful home, and it was amazing how kind people were. They took in those boys, they coped with everything, musical instruments, the lot. It's absolutely fantastic, the spirit that existed in wartime. Well, to go back to what happened then, for some reason Hitler didn't bomb us straight away. We had one or two false alarms where the air raid siren went. But after 2 months, nothing had happened virtually in the way of bombing or anything like that. So my brother's school came back from Gloucester to Birmingham because a lot of the boys had been withdrawn from Gloucester and brought back home. And I came back because my school opened, so I was only at Grandma's for 2 months. Then we were at home over the winter and Christmas of 1939, and the bombing didn't really start until the summer of 1940, but by September, October, then it really started. But in the meantime, while I was away at Grandma's at the beginning of the war, we received an Anderson air raid shelter. Now, how it was delivered and how the hole was dug, I don't actually know. But I suspect that my grandfather dug the hole because he was retired, and all the soil that he dug out then had to go back on the top. It was made of corrugated iron, and you know the shape of it because you've seen one. But corrugated iron then had to have all the garden soil put on the top of it, and he restored his beautiful garden, which he loved so much. It was only small, but he loved it. He thought, now, and we got this shelter up, it didn't have a door, and it didn't have any steps down into it. So he was good with his hands, so he made like a fisherman's ladder down a quayside, but wide and narrow, so that we stepped down the rungs into the air raid shelter, which kept the shelter a bit bigger than it would otherwise have been. And he also made a door, and that had swivel knobs so that it would move out or in with the expansion of a blast from a bomb, so that it would blow out or be sucked in one way or the other. Usually it went out. And he thought, now, what are we going to sit on in this gloomy, dark, cold shelter? So he thought, well, we're going to be short of coal, because we didn't have central heating or anything like that in those days. We're going to be short of coal. Right, orange boxes from the greengrocer, which were a sort of plywoody softwood, which people used for firewood, really. They were just given away. He got some orange boxes, and he thought, right, well, we'll fit those in the shelter, and we'll put coal inside them, and I'll put a lid on them that lifts up, and then we'll sit on the seats in the shelter. Well, we had one night like that. Dreadful, sitting on these hard boxes all night long, because they were quite long nights by then. September, October, they were quite long nights of air, you know, the actual air raid when you stayed in the shelter. That idea didn't last long. So he then had the idea of deck chairs. So we sat in deck chairs in the air raid shelter. My brother, eldest brother, who at the time when war broke out was 15, and my second brother was 13, my eldest brother decided that we had to have a light in the air raid shelter, and there was no health and safety to stop him, so he rigged up an electric light from the kitchen down outside and into the shelter, which gave us some light there, because of course you apart from torches, you didn't leave any lights on anywhere that could be seen. Underneath the sink in the scullery, every night we had a square Crawford's biscuit tin, well, two tins. One contained the supper sandwiches and the other one contained the first aid kit, and those were put under the kitchen sink every night. and at some lull in the air raid, my eldest brother would go and get the supper tin from underneath the kitchen sink. So many times we had supper in the air raid shelter. But my father was air raid warden, so he was out every single night as soon as the air raid siren went. So of course I was always worried about Daddy. My grandfather stayed with us children, and my mother went out. They had a roster where they had to patrol a certain section of the road to make sure all the stirrup pumps had been put out and the bucket of water and the bucket of sand had all been put outside ready. And she remembers being told that if she heard a bomb coming down, she was to lie down in the gutter. And she thought, what a lot of protection that would be. But it was like Dad's army, it really was. So then we had to put out, when the air raid started, we had to put our clothing all folded up neatly at the end of the bed. I can't see modern children doing this, but our clothing, as we took it off, was piled up neatly. We had to do that, and we had to put slippers and dressing gown, which we did possess, but some families didn't, beside the bed. And as soon as the air raid siren started to wail, we were supposed to get dressed in our bedrooms immediately and go downstairs to the shelter. But I used to tremble so much that they couldn't actually dress me, and I couldn't dress myself. The only place where I felt safe was in the air raid shelter. So I used to take all my clothing down into the shelter and get dressed in there, because that was the only way I could stop trembling. I really did tremble very, very badly. And even now, if I hear an air raid siren on TV, my tummy still turns over, even to this day. And I'm 82 now. So I don't think it'll ever stop. So these air raids went on, and you never knew whether your mother, your father, your brothers were going to be alive the next day. It got really, really bad. The reason being that there was a railway line that led to the brewery when my father was the chemist at the brewery, second chemist at the brewery. He was too old to be called up in the Second World War. That's how he came to be a warden. But this line, railway line, stood out very clearly from the air, as did rivers and canals. Now there was this little single track railway line that ran to the brewery, and this attracted the bombers from Germany. And so we had a great many bombs in our area. After, well, it got to December 1940, and I was getting in such a nervous state because I think, what would they be, 16, 14, my brothers. I think that was when they had started to do fire watching at their school. The caretaker had been called up, and the older boys were allowed to stoke the boiler for the school and generally look after things at the school. And they used to go up there on a rota, and they were paid for doing it, actually. And there was a landmine that hit one of the houses opposite the school, and some of their schoolmates were killed, which was quite grim. But because things were getting so bad with me, a cousin who I had never met, I knew her sister who lived in Birmingham near us, but I'd never met this cousin. She said, what about sending Margaret out to me in the country? This was Oswestry in Shropshire. And so my parents consulted me and said, you know, would I like to go there? And I didn't really want to, but there didn't seem to be any option but to get me away from it. So I was sent to Oswestry. I can remember the date now. It was December the 4th, 1940. 40, and my mother took me by train up to Oswald Street. It took nearly all day to get there, and I went to this cottage, and my mother stayed the night, and I met this Auntie Hilda, who was actually the head of the girls' high school there. And she took me, and she had a housekeeper, and she took me in. And I went to that school, and I stayed there for 6 years till I'd done my, what were, not GCSEs in those days, they were school certificate in those days. So I stayed after the war had ended there. But when I went on December the 4th, apparently I was in such a state that they had to keep going back in the night to put bedclothes back on top of me. I don't remember being in that state, but I do remember very clearly going there. And the thing that I think is so dreadful that people wouldn't understand, I had no communication with my parents or anybody from the family for 32 weeks, which is pretty horrific for a child of 10. I mean, they complained about children not being allowed to see their parents when they were in hospital, but 32 weeks. And the only thing I knew was the news. There had been a raid on a West Midland town, which meant Birmingham, Wolverhampton or Coventry, which was on the news. That was the most news. They never said the actual place. And I had a letter once a week from my mother. So you can imagine that life was a bit grim. My childhood had come to an end. I'd gone to a strange place, knew nobody, went to a strange school, started at grammar school level, hadn't got school uniform, was just horribly out of place there. But that was how it was. So I don't have happy memories of the war at all. As I say, I was there for 32 weeks, and then I did come home for the summer holidays because the war had lapsed a bit and it was considered safe enough for me to come. But how I cried and cried and cried at going back. I didn't want to eat anything. I mean, nowadays you see that doctors would take over all this sort of trauma, but in those days you didn't see a doctor about anything like that. You just coped and hoped, really. So eventually our house wasn't actually hit, but the house opposite was hit, and we didn't know the people very well. They hadn't been there very long, so I had no memories of them, but I believe 2 were killed. Next door but one to them, they had a bomb which didn't explode, and it went right through the house and down into the ground. And my father said, if you don't get that bomb out straight away, you won't get it out for a fortnight because it'll sink so far down, the sand apparently. And we had to all be evacuated. I was away, but everybody had to be evacuated from around the area because of this unexploded bomb. My parents went to some relatives in a parallel road with my grandfather, not very far away, and my brothers went to one of their teachers from school, took them in, because I was away, so it didn't apply to me. But my father allowed the bomb disposal squad, who were trying to get this bomb out, to use our house as their depot. And they had an awful job. They nearly lost a man trying to get this bomb out. And when they did eventually, it took about a fortnight, my father and grandfather were allowed to go in the house the day they handed it over to the bomb squad. They were allowed to go in and turn all the furniture so that the good side was facing inside and the bad side was against the windows, because we had some quite nice furniture in those days. Well, it was considered nice because you bought for life in those days. So they were able, because the windows had gone with the bomb that was opposite to us, so the windows had gone, so they turned the furniture so that its back was to the window. And the bomb squad used our house, and that was for a fortnight. Well, when my parents did come back, my grandfather complained bitterly that he couldn't find his gardening boots. And it seemed that when they did get this man out, he had lost his shoes. The one that was getting the bomb had lost his shoes, and they had to heave him out to save his life, really. They had just taken any clothing they needed to clothe him, in point of fact, but we didn't know that at the time. And of course I didn't know very much about it. I only heard afterwards what they considered right to tell me about that time. I know that my parents had exchanged clothes, so that there was a suitcase full of clothes for my parents at these relatives just on a parallel road, and there were some of their clothes at our place in case of bombing, so that they wear clothes. That was an exchange of clothing from one house to another to cover whatever situation might arise. At some stage, while I was away in that first 2 months of the war, bunk beds were delivered for the Anderson shelters. They were quite narrow, they were made of wood, and they had metal slats. What we covered them with to actually lie on, I can't remember whether my mother had to use blankets from the house or what. We certainly, as I remember, we didn't have any mattress on them, but we must have had something. In that September-October of 1940, when we were being bombed so badly before I was finally evacuated, I used to go to bed actually in the shelter, put myself to bed in the shelter rather than get up when the siren sounded. And for some reason which I still don't know, I heard some distant wailing of an air raid siren before anybody else in our house, always. And I was always the first up, and I was calling out to my parents and so on before our actual local siren went. I suppose that was part of being so frightened. Who knows? What else can I tell you?
Can we go to perhaps, because I think that's given a really lovely description of the experience of them being effectively evacuated and
Yes.
being in the shelter. What happened at the end of the war? Do you remember the end of the war?
Oh yes. We were waiting for the end of the war. I was still at this high school, and we evacuees had been told that we could go home, because by that time I'd been moved into a boarding house. It didn't belong to our school, it was a private boarding school who took in the evacuees from the high school that I attended. They were mainly, the children at this private boarding school were mainly weekly boarders from local farming communities, but they took in evacuees in the dormitories, and I remember that we knew the war was going to end soon, and we evacuees had been told that we would be allowed to go home for 2 days, those of us who hadn't got that far to travel. And we kept waiting for the war to end. But I did go home, and I can remember that everybody turned their electric lights on. No more blackout. Oh, what joy! Because it was quite a task to do all the blackout at whatever time was blackout time each night, particularly in the winter. So everybody had their lights on, and in the side streets they organised radio, gramophone records in those days, and they were dancing and cheering and celebrating. I mean, there wasn't food to celebrate with, but they were outside. They could make as much noise as they liked. They could cheer. Oh, it was wonderful. Everybody was so excited. And of course the men would be coming home from the war, which is even greater. So we had 2 days at home, then we had to go back to school. The Japanese war actually ended in school holidays because it ended in August. So that wasn't really quite as exciting in a way, because there were less of our troops involved. But nevertheless, the excitement of the war in Europe ending was really, really something. And of course everybody thought everything was going to happen immediately and the world was going to go back to how it used to be, and it didn't. But that's another story.